Hey, welcome back to Silent Screams. You know, some nights, just before you go to bed, there's that one thing you heard or read that just sticks in your mind. A story that haunts you, lingering in the corners of your room. Tonight, I've got one of those stories for you. This one is straight from Reddit, but it's one of those threads that feel a little too real. It starts off normal enough, just another weird tale. But trust me, this one takes a turn. You might want to turn off the lights for the full experience, or maybe, leave them on. It all started when I rented this small cabin out in the middle of nowhere. I'd been feeling suffocated by city life and wanted to escape for a bit, just disconnect. The listing was simple: private cabin in the woods. Perfect for solo retreat. The pictures showed a cozy wooden structure nestled among dense trees, with a creek winding through the property. It seemed too good to be true. For the price, I figured, why not? I could write, read, and maybe even reconnect with some kind of inner peace. The host messaged me right after I booked it. "Enjoy the solitude," they wrote. "No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no interruptions." That was exactly what I was looking for. When I arrived, it was late afternoon, the sun sinking behind the forest. The cabin looked exactly as it did in the photos, but the woods seemed different. The air was thick, and it was eerily quiet. Not even a breeze rustling the leaves. I brushed it off as my city mind overreacting. This was nature. Real, untouched nature. As I stepped inside, I noticed that everything felt frozen in time. There were candles on every windowsill, some half melted, others new. And the air inside? Stale, as if no one had opened a window in years. I quickly unpacked and tried to settle in. The first few hours were peaceful. I made myself some tea, read a bit, and just enjoyed the stillness. But as the sky turned darker, something shifted. The silence became oppressive, like a heavy blanket pressing down on my chest. I decided to go for a quick walk, thinking some fresh air might help shake off the nerves. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. The trees loomed above, their branches twisting and reaching out like fingers. Every step I took crunched loudly against the leaves and twigs on the ground. It was as if the forest was listening. About 15 minutes in, I realized I didn't know exactly where I was. I'd wandered off the main path without even realizing it. I turned around, trying to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same, shadowy and unfamiliar. "Hello?" I called out, feeling ridiculous, but hoping maybe someone else was out here. My voice was swallowed by the darkness. That's when I noticed it. A faint light in the distance, flickering like a candle. It wasn't coming from the cabin. I knew I had locked it up. Curious, and maybe a little desperate, I headed toward it. The light grew brighter as I approached, until I finally saw its source. It was an old lantern, hanging from a tree branch. Beneath it, someone had carved symbols into the bark. The symbols looked ancient, almost like runes. And beneath those carvings was something even more disturbing: a small bundle wrapped in cloth, hanging from the branch like a grotesque ornament. I took a step back, my heart racing. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew out the lantern's light, plunging everything into darkness. Snap! I whipped around, shining my flashlight wildly into the trees. For a second, I thought I saw a figure standing there, just at the edge of the light. Tall and thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. But when I blinked, it was gone. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. I needed to get back to the cabin. Now. As I turned and started running, the forest seemed to close in around me. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow stretched longer. It was as if the woods themselves were alive, watching, waiting. Finally, I burst through the tree line, the cabin just ahead. Relief washed over me as I reached the door, slamming it shut behind me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. But just as I was starting to calm down, I noticed something strange. The candles in the cabin were all lit. I was sure they hadn't been when I left. My hands shook as I moved through the rooms, checking each one. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for those flickering candles casting long shadows on the walls. Then I heard it. A soft, raspy whisper. It was coming from somewhere inside the cabin. "Get out." The voice was so faint, like it was drifting on the air. I froze, trying to pinpoint its source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Heart pounding, I turned toward the door, ready to leave, but then, the door wouldn't budge. It was like something was holding it shut. "Please," I whispered, barely able to hear my own voice over the rush of my heartbeat. "Let me out." The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Get out, get out, get out." Suddenly, the windows rattled, as if something outside was trying to break in. The lights flickered, casting strange, twisted shadows across the walls. I could feel it, a presence, cold and menacing, pressing down on me. "Why are you here?" A new voice whispered, this one lower, angrier. I didn't mean to intrude," I stammered, my voice shaking. "I was just trying to get away." The silence returned, heavier than before. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. But then, something brushed past me, cold as ice, leaving a trail of goosebumps on my skin. I spun around, flashlight in hand, and saw a face. Pale, hollow, its eyes black as night. It was inches from mine, close enough that I could feel its icy breath. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered. I stumbled backward, tripping over the rug and landing hard on the floor. My flashlight rolled away, its beam illuminating the far wall where dozens of handprints, smeared in a dark, reddish stain, covered the wood. They hadn't been there before. The whispers returned, louder, overlapping, filling the room with a chorus of voices, each one more desperate than the last. They were pleading, begging, warning. "Leave now, before it's too late." The front door suddenly flew open, slamming against the wall with a deafening bang. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering, and dashed out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I just kept running, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the property, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. When I finally turned around, the cabin was dark, silent. But as I stood there, catching my breath, I saw it, a figure in the window, watching me, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It raised a hand, pressing it against the glass, and mouthed something I couldn't hear. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back in my car, speeding down the dirt road, away from that cursed place. I don't know what I saw that night, or if any of it was even real. But every now and then, when I'm alone, I can still feel that icy breath on the back of my neck, still hear that faint whisper telling me to. I didn't stop driving until I was halfway down the mountain, the road winding through the darkness like some endless tunnel. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, knuckles white, eyes darting to every shadow on the roadside. It felt like something was watching me, following me, waiting for the right moment to close in. I pulled off at a small overlook, desperately needing to calm down. As I sat there in the quiet, the memory of that icy breath, those glowing eyes, replayed over and over in my head. It was as if a part of that place had followed me, lingering in the back of my mind, whispering to me from some dark corner. A low fog rolled in, creeping along the edges of the road like fingers reaching out from the darkness. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. This was just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. It had to be. Everything I'd seen, it couldn't be real. But then I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, in the fog behind the car, was a figure, barely visible but unmistakably there. My heart froze as I watched it, tall and thin, its face shrouded in shadow, just like before. Its eyes were those same hollow pits, dark and empty, and yet I could feel them watching me, waiting. I blinked, and it was gone. No. I couldn't stay here. I started the car, hands trembling, and pulled back onto the road, determined to put as much distance as possible between myself and that cabin. But even as I drove, I could feel it, the weight of that presence pressing down on me, like something had latched onto me, sinking its claws deep into my mind. The road was empty, winding through the woods, the fog growing thicker. Soon, I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I slowed down, squinting through the haze, when suddenly the radio crackled to life, filling the car with static. "Hello?" I muttered, even though I knew it was ridiculous. The radio was ancient, barely functional, but the static grew louder, hissing like whispers just beyond my understanding. I reached out to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. My heart pounded as the whispers grew louder, filling the car with a chorus of voices, each one overlapping the other, each one desperate. "Why did you leave? You shouldn't have come, he's waiting for you." I slapped the radio, desperate to make it stop, and the voices went silent, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. My breath came out in ragged gasps as I tried to pull myself together. This was impossible. Radios didn't just do that. None of this made any sense. I kept driving, forcing myself to focus on the road. But no matter how far I drove, the fog stayed thick, the trees looming on either side like silent sentinels, watching, waiting. And then, out of nowhere, my headlights caught something in the road ahead. It was the cabin. I slammed on the brakes, heart thudding as I stared at it, sitting there on the side of the road, just as it had been before. The same dark windows, the same twisted trees surrounding it. But this was impossible. I'd driven miles away from it. There was no way I could be back here. I reversed, turning the car around, and sped off in the other direction. But the fog only grew thicker, swallowing the road, twisting it into unfamiliar shapes. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and my heart raced as I realized I had no idea where I was. I'd driven this road before, but now it felt foreign, like a maze I couldn't escape. And then, up ahead, I saw it again. The cabin. This time, it was different. There was a faint light glowing from inside, flickering like candlelight. I could see shadows moving across the windows, twisted shapes that seemed to writhe and twist as if they were alive. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I stared, unable to look away. "Come back," a voice whispered from the shadows, soft and insistent. I slammed the gas, tearing down the road as fast as I could. But the fog followed me, pressing in on all sides, and no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed to move with me, slipping through the trees, keeping pace with the car. And then the road dead-ended. I skidded to a stop, staring at the dark forest stretching out before me. This road wasn't supposed to end here. I'd driven it before, I knew it led back to town. But now, it was like the forest had swallowed the road, cutting off any escape. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what this meant. There was no way out. As I sat there, heart pounding, the radio crackled to life again. This time, the static was softer, almost like a lullaby, lulling me into a strange calm. And then, a voice spoke, soft and haunting, familiar in a way I couldn't explain. "You can't leave," it whispered. "He won't let you." My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the radio, my mind racing. Who was he? What was this presence that had followed me from the cabin? But before I could answer, the fog began to lift, and I saw it, the cabin, standing just a few feet away, the front door wide open, waiting. Something inside me told me I had to go back. That if I didn't, I'd be trapped here forever, lost in this endless fog. I didn't want to go back, didn't want to face whatever was waiting for me inside. But as I looked around, I realized I had no choice. I stepped out of the car, the cold air wrapping around me like a shroud. The forest was silent, the fog pressing in on all sides as I made my way to the cabin. The door creaked open as I approached, and I stepped inside, heart pounding. The candles were lit, casting a flickering glow over the room. The shadows danced on the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. And there, standing in the center of the room, was the figure. It was taller than I remembered, its form shifting and changing as I stared at it. Its face was a hollow mask, eyes dark and empty, mouth stretched into a twisted grin. It raised a hand, beckoning me closer. "Why did you leave?" It whispered, voice echoing through the room. "Why did you run?" I didn't," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. I was scared." The figure laughed, a low, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. "Fear," it whispered, almost lovingly. "That's what he feeds on." "Who?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Who is he?" The figure tilted its head, its empty eyes boring into mine. "He is the one who waits in the shadows," it whispered. "The one who watches, who follows, who never lets go." The candles flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls, and I realized I could see other figures there, watching from the darkness. Dozens of them, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes dark and empty, each one a silent witness to my terror. I took a step back, heart racing, but the figure raised a hand, stopping me in my tracks. "There's no escape," it whispered. "Once you've seen him, he's always with you." The shadows began to close in, pressing down on me, suffocating me with their cold presence. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat, swallowed by the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I was standing outside the cabin, the forest silent and still. The fog had lifted, revealing a clear path back to my car. I didn't question it. I just ran, my heart pounding as I tore through the trees, desperate to escape. I reached the car, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. But as I slid into the driver's seat, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. 3B. The door was closed, the windows dark. But in that moment, I saw him, standing there, watching me with those hollow eyes, a twisted smile on his face. And I knew, deep down, that he would always be with me. As I drove away, the road seemed normal again, the trees no longer looming, the fog a distant memory. But even now, weeks later, I can still feel him. In every shadow, in every dark corner, he's there, watching, waiting.
Welcome to Silent Screams. I'm your guide through the shadows and silence, where the usual safety of small towns is peeled back, and the terror that lingers beneath is brought to light. Tonight, we're diving into a tale from a quiet town, where secrets don't stay hidden, and no place is safe after dark. They say every town has its stories. Growing up, I always thought they were just tales to scare kids or to add a little mystery to dull places. But that was before I spent a night in Lancaster Grove, an out-of-the-way, blink and you'll miss it town with only a few hundred people, and, as I came to learn, a chilling past. It all began when my friend Kevin invited me to join him on a weekend trip. Kevin's family had just inherited a farmhouse there, one of those passed down through generations kind of places. At first, I hesitated. I'd heard Lancaster Grove had some strange stories. Kevin laughed it off and said they were just tales spun by old-timers and teenagers trying to look tough. He swore the place was perfectly safe and, he joked, it even had a cozy, haunted house vibe. So, against my better judgment, I agreed to join him, thinking it'd just be a quiet weekend with a few eerie stories. The farmhouse stood on the edge of town, isolated from the other houses. The place had a haunting beauty to it, tall, with peeling white paint, windows darkened by grime and time. The land around it was vast, stretching into a mix of wild grass and trees that crept close to the house, almost as if they were drawn to it. The air smelled old, as though time had stopped years ago and never moved forward. That first night, as we unpacked, the house seemed to breathe around us. Every step we took was answered by the creak of old floorboards, groaning as if they were tired of being disturbed. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint sounds of the wind pushing against the walls. Kevin tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes about ghost hunting and putting on a fake, dramatic voice. "Look out, folks," he said, doing his best TV host impression. "Will we survive the night, or will we be claimed by the ghosts of Lancaster Grove?" I laughed, but something about the house felt off. Kevin's voice echoed strangely, as if the walls were swallowing it whole, holding onto it like a secret. We decided to explore a bit, checking out each room. Everything was layered in dust, untouched relics from another time. In the main hallway, a large mirror hung on the wall, its surface cracked and darkened. As I glanced into it, I saw something that made me pause. A shadow moved, just behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Kevin noticed my expression and raised an eyebrow. "You good?" he asked. "Yeah, just thought I saw something, that's all." He shrugged it off and kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, watching us. Later, as we settled into the living room, Kevin found a few old photo albums stashed away in a cabinet. He flipped through them, pointing out the old black and white photos of people who must have lived there long before. The people looked stern, unsmiling. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at one particular photo, a young girl with hollow eyes and a vacant expression. It felt as though she was staring directly at me, like she knew I was there. As the night wore on, the house grew colder. We both bundled up, blaming the drafty windows. Kevin tossed a few logs into the fireplace, and soon, the room filled with the warm crackling of flames. For a while, it was almost cozy. But then the noises began. It started as a faint tapping, coming from somewhere above us. Kevin brushed it off, saying it was probably the old house settling. But the tapping turned to knocking, a steady, rhythmic sound that seemed to travel down the walls, growing louder, closer. "All right, that's freaky," Kevin admitted, trying to laugh but failing. Just then, we heard it, a soft, raspy whisper, somewhere down the hall. We froze, staring at each other, our eyes wide. Neither of us dared to speak as the whisper grew louder, clearer. "Leave, you shouldn't be here," Kevin gulped, his face pale. Did you hear that?" I nodded, too afraid to answer. We both stood up, clutching our phones like they could somehow protect us. Then, the lights flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows along the walls. The whisper was gone, replaced by a suffocating silence. But as we took a step towards the hallway, we saw something that stopped us cold, a figure, standing at the end of the corridor, bathed in shadows. It was just standing there, unmoving, its shape barely visible in the dim light. "Hello?" Kevin called, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but I swear I saw its head tilt, as if it was studying us, deciding what to do next. Then, in a single, agonizingly slow motion, it raised an arm and pointed at us. "Go, now," the voice came again, low and raspy, but this time, it sounded closer. We bolted, running back to the living room and slamming the door behind us. Our breaths came fast, our minds racing. Kevin scrambled to lock the door, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the latch. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Yeah, I saw it." We sat there in silence, listening, waiting. The house seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, like it was alive, watching us, waiting for us to make a move. A soft thud echoed from the other side of the door, followed by a slow, scraping sound, as if someone, or something, was dragging something heavy down the hall. What is that?" I stammered, my heart pounding. "I don't know, man. I don't know." Just then, the doorknob rattled, violently, as though someone was trying to force it open. Kevin and I backed away, our eyes fixed on the door, which was now bulging slightly as if something on the other side was pressing against it. And then, just as suddenly, the rattling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. After a moment, Kevin whispered, maybe it's gone." I shook my head, not daring to hope. But just as we began to relax, a new sound filled the room, a soft, slow scraping, coming from the fireplace. We turned, horrified, as a thin, bony hand emerged from the ashes, gripping the edge of the hearth. "Run!" Kevin shouted, and we bolted out of the room, racing down the hallway towards the stairs. But as we reached the landing, a voice echoed from behind us. "You can't leave." It was the same voice, only this time, it was filled with a chilling anger. We stumbled up the stairs, slamming the door behind us as we reached the top. The house seemed to close in around us, every shadow lengthening, stretching, as if trying to trap us. We huddled in the dark, our breaths coming in short, panicked gasps, as footsteps echoed up the stairs, slow and deliberate. Kevin looked at me, his face pale with fear. What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we were trapped, with nowhere to run and no one to call for help. I nodded at Kevin, heart pounding as we both pressed ourselves against the door, trying to catch our breath. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt thick, charged with something unseen but undeniably there, lurking, waiting. I glanced at Kevin, his face pale and strained in the dim light. What did you see downstairs?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, as if he feared the walls would overhear. "I don't know," I replied, shaking my head, my hands still trembling. "But it was real, Kev. I swear. That hand. It was like it came out of the ashes itself." Kevin took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Maybe we're just tired," he muttered, as if saying it out loud might convince himself. "This house is playing tricks on us. Let's just wait it out until morning, yeah?" But even as he said it, his eyes betrayed him. We both knew this wasn't just exhaustion. There was something in this house, something angry, and we had trespassed into its territory. Suddenly, a low creak echoed from the hallway outside. My blood froze as a soft whisper drifted under the door. "Come out." I could barely breathe, and Kevin's hand tightened on my arm, pulling me closer. We both stared at the door, praying it wouldn't move, wouldn't open. But the whisper came again, louder this time, and more insistent. "We see you." The doorknob rattled slightly, then stilled. I tried to think of a plan, something to get us out of this nightmare, but my mind was blank, clouded by terror. Then, Kevin's eyes locked onto something behind me, and he gasped, his face going deathly white. I turned slowly, and there it was, a figure, shadowy but unmistakably there, hovering in the far corner of the room. It was barely visible, but its eyes shone like embers, piercing the darkness, fixed directly on us. "Kev, do you see that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. He nodded, his face twisted in horror. The figure began to move, gliding closer, its form shifting and flickering in the dim light. I could barely make out the shape, a woman, or something that had once been a woman. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes hollow and accusing. "You shouldn't have come here," she hissed, her voice like nails scraping against glass. We stumbled backward, pressing ourselves against the door as she drew closer, her features growing more twisted, more grotesque. And then she stopped, her gaze shifting between us, a twisted smile spreading across her face. "Do you know what they did to me?" she whispered, her voice dripping with pain and anger. "Do you know what this place is?" I shook my head, my voice caught in my throat. She laughed, a sound that seemed to echo off the walls, filling the room with its cold, bitter edge. "This house, it was built on blood," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Long ago, a family, taken, one by one, they tried to hide me, tried to bury their sins, but I remain. I will always remain." A chill ran down my spine as her face twisted, her eyes narrowing. "And now, you are mine." With those words, she vanished, leaving only a cold, empty silence behind. Kevin and I stared at each other, too terrified to move, too afraid to speak. But before we could process what had happened, a loud bang echoed from the hallway, followed by another, and then another, as if something massive was slamming against the walls, trying to break through. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, grabbing Kevin's arm. He nodded, and together, we stumbled toward the window, our only hope of escape. But as we reached it, the banging stopped, replaced by an eerie, deathly silence. We froze, listening, waiting. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a figure, hunched and twisted, its face shrouded in darkness. It moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, like a puppet with its strings tangled. And then it spoke, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. "You can't leave," it rasped, its voice echoing through the room. My heart raced as the figure stepped closer, its form shifting and twisting, as if it was struggling to hold its shape. Kevin and I backed away, inching toward the window, desperate to escape. But the figure moved faster, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. And then, without thinking, I grabbed the heavy lamp on the bedside table and swung it at the figure. The lamp shattered, and for a moment, the figure seemed to waver, its form flickering like a dying flame. But then it reformed, stronger, more solid, its face twisting into a mask of rage. "You will stay," it hissed, its voice dripping with venom. I grabbed Kevin's arm, and together, we threw open the window, scrambling onto the ledge. The drop was steep, but anything was better than staying in that room. We clung to the ledge, our fingers digging into the rough wood, as the figure loomed closer, its eyes blazing with a terrifying hunger. "Jump!" Kevin shouted, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Without hesitation, I let go, plummeting to the ground below. The impact was jarring, sending pain shooting through my legs, but I forced myself to my feet, pulling Kevin up beside me. We didn't stop running, even as we stumbled over rocks and roots, even as branches clawed at our faces, leaving scratches and bruises. We ran until we couldn't breathe, until the house was nothing but a distant shadow, hidden behind the trees. Finally, we collapsed onto the cold ground, gasping for air, our bodies shaking with fear and exhaustion. We didn't speak, didn't look back. All I could think about was the figure, its eyes, its voice, the way it had seemed to reach into my very soul, pulling at something deep and dark within me. After what felt like hours, we managed to find our way back to town, stumbling into the nearest diner, our clothes torn and dirty, our faces pale and hollow. The few people inside turned to stare, their eyes widening as they took in our disheveled appearance. Where did you come from?" one of them asked, his voice filled with shock. "Lancaster Grove," Kevin managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's face went pale, his eyes flickering with something that looked like fear. He didn't say anything, just shook his head, muttering something under his breath. We didn't stay long. As soon as we caught our breath, we left, not stopping until we were miles away, leaving Lancaster Grove and its horrors behind us. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Every night, as I lie in bed, I feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear a whisper, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the darkness. "You can't leave." It's as if the house marked us, like it won't rest until we're back within its walls, trapped forever in its twisted embrace. And maybe, someday, it'll come for us, pulling us back to Lancaster Grove, back to that cursed place where the dead never sleep, and the living are just visitors, passing through on borrowed time. Until then, I'll try to forget. But deep down, I know the truth. Some things can't be escaped. Some nightmares never end. And Lancaster Grove is waiting.
Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we're diving into the shadows of small-town America, where the past is never truly gone, and the darkest secrets linger in every empty street, every abandoned house, and every silent night. These aren't just stories. They're real, chilling encounters sent to us by those who live in these forgotten corners, where strange things have a habit of creeping up when no one's looking. Our first tale comes from a small town in Illinois, a place where everyone knows each other, but nobody dares to talk about the mansion on the hill. Some say it's cursed, Others think it's haunted, but one thing is certain, no one who's gone inside ever talks about it again. This is a story from a guy named Matt, and he still can't shake off what he saw that night. So, grab your headphones, dim the lights, and let's get started. I never believed in ghosts, curses, or any of that paranormal stuff. I always thought the stories people told were just that, stories. But now, I don't know. What happened that night feels as real as the air I'm breathing. And even as I talk about it now, I can feel the chills creeping up my spine, like whatever it was is still out there, watching me. It was late November, just a few days before Thanksgiving. I'd come back to my hometown of Glenview for the holiday, just a sleepy little town in the middle of nowhere, Illinois. Glenview was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, and the most exciting event of the year was the annual Fall Festival. Nothing ever happened in Glenview, except for what happened in the old Richmond mansion. The mansion was perched on a hill at the edge of town, just beyond the woods. It had been abandoned for years, and kids dared each other to go in all the time, but no one really did. There were all sorts of stories about it, how the original owners, the Richmonds, had disappeared without a trace one winter night, leaving everything behind. Their dinner, untouched, was still on the table. That was over 50 years ago, and the place had been left to rot ever since. That night, my friend Nick dared me to go up there. We'd been drinking a bit, and at the time, it seemed like a good idea. "Come on, Matt, don't be a chicken," he laughed, his voice echoing through the quiet, empty street. "You're always talking tough. Prove it." I didn't want to back down. I knew Nick would never let me live it down if I chickened out. So, with a forced laugh, I agreed. "Fine," I said. "But you're coming with me." Together, we made our way through the woods, the full moon casting a pale, eerie glow on the path ahead. The trees seemed to close in around us as we walked, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I could feel the cold biting through my jacket, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't let Nick see me spooked. When we finally reached the mansion, I was struck by just how dark it was. The windows were like black holes, and the air was still, almost, waiting. The front door was slightly ajar, as if inviting us inside. "Ladies first," Nick snickered, giving me a little shove. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath our feet, and every step seemed to echo through the empty halls. The place smelled musty, like old wood and mildew, and the walls were lined with faded, peeling wallpaper. A large staircase spiraled up into the darkness, and a massive chandelier hung overhead, its crystals coated in dust. We wandered through the rooms, daring each other to go farther. There was an unsettling feeling that hung in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was like the whole house was watching us, waiting for us to do something wrong. "Did you hear that?" Nick whispered, his voice barely audible. I strained my ears, and that's when I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from somewhere above us. It was soft, barely more than a breath, but it was there. Goosebumps prickled up my arms. "It's probably just the wind," I muttered, though my voice didn't sound as confident as I wanted it to. Nick shook his head. "Wind doesn't sound like that, man." That sounded like the voice. We exchanged a nervous glance, but neither of us wanted to be the first to suggest leaving. Instead, we decided to go upstairs, where the whisper had come from. The stairs creaked under our weight, each step making my heart pound faster. When we reached the top, we found ourselves in a long hallway lined with doors. Each one was closed, and each one looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. There was something about those doors that made me uneasy. They seemed almost alive, like they were hiding something that didn't want to be disturbed. I could feel my pulse quicken as we approached the first door. "Open it," Nick whispered, and I could tell he was just as freaked out as I was. With a shaking hand, I reached for the doorknob. It was cold, colder than it should have been, and as I turned it, I felt a strange resistance, like something on the other side was trying to keep it closed. But I pushed harder, and the door finally creaked open. Inside was a small bedroom, empty except for a bed and a broken dresser. The bed was neatly made, the sheets tucked in as if someone had just left it, but there was a thick layer of dust covering everything. And then, I saw it, a handprint on the window, smeared as if someone had been clawing at the glass from the inside. "What the hell?" I whispered, backing away from the window. Nick was staring at it, his face pale. Maybe we should go." Just as he said that, we heard the whisper again, louder this time. It sounded like it was coming from the end of the hall. Without thinking, we followed it, drawn to the sound like moths to a flame. The whisper led us to the last door in the hallway. I didn't want to open it, but I felt compelled, like something was pulling me towards it. I reached out, my hand trembling, and slowly turned the knob. Inside was a study, the walls lined with bookshelves. There was a large, ornate desk in the center of the room, and on it lay a single, open book. The pages were blank, but there was something wrong about it. I couldn't explain it, but just looking at it made my skin crawl. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut. We were trapped. Nick pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural laugh, echoing through the room. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, a sound that made my blood run cold. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. The laugh stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice, soft and chilling, spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, yet I could feel something. Something dark and malevolent, something that wanted us gone. Nick and I backed away, pressing ourselves against the wall as the shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, closing in around us. The air grew thick, and I felt like I was suffocating. I could see the terror in Nick's eyes, and I knew he was feeling the same thing. Then, out of nowhere, the door swung open, and we bolted. We ran down the stairs, through the empty halls, and out into the cold night air, not stopping until we were far away from that cursed house. We never spoke about it again. We didn't need to. The fear in each other's eyes said it all.
We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of town, gasping for breath and clutching our sides. I could still feel the icy fingers of that house lingering on my skin, the chilling laughter echoing in my ears. I was haunted, and I could tell Nick felt the same way. But we didn't say a word, we didn't need to. The days that followed were strange. I'd thought that putting distance between me and that house would bring some kind of peace, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, disappearing just as I turned to look. At night, I'd hear the faintest whisper, the same words we'd heard in that house, "You shouldn't have come here." One night, a few days after our experience, I finally mustered the courage to tell my mom about it. She was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when I brought it up. I was embarrassed. She'd always teased me for my wild imagination, but this was different. I had to tell someone. "Mom," I began, choosing my words carefully, "have you ever heard anything about the old Richmond place?" Her hands stopped moving, and I noticed her knuckles go white as she gripped the countertop. She turned to me, her face pale, and nodded slowly. "Why do you ask?" I went up there with Nick," I said, barely able to meet her gaze. "Something happened. We heard voices, and, before I could finish, she grabbed my arm." "You went there?" Her voice was a harsh whisper. "Matt, you should never have gone near that place." I pulled back, stunned by the intensity in her eyes. "Why?" "It's just an old house. I mean, it was creepy, but it's not just a house." She looked around the kitchen as if afraid someone might hear us, even though we were alone. "There's a reason the Richmonds disappeared, and it's a story nobody in this town likes to tell." "Mom, what do you mean?" I asked, the hair on my arm standing up as she lowered her voice. "Long before the Richmonds lived there, the land belonged to a man named Emmett Graves," she whispered. "He was a strange, reclusive man who kept to himself. People said he was into dark things. He was obsessed with the idea of life beyond death, trying to contact spirits, invoking powers no one understood. He built a house on that land, and strange things started happening. People heard voices, saw things that shouldn't have been there. Finally, one night, Emmett just vanished." "He vanished?" I stammered. She nodded solemnly. "After that, no one wanted anything to do with the place. But the Richmonds were new to town and didn't know the stories. They bought the land, built that mansion, and for a while, everything seemed fine. But then, they disappeared, too. People said they'd been taken." I felt a chill creep down my spine. I remembered the voice in the house, telling us we shouldn't have come. It had felt as if the walls themselves were watching us, waiting. "But, we got out," I said, trying to reassure myself. My mom shook her head, her face grim. "Emmett's spirit, or whatever remains of it, doesn't let go that easily. The stories say that once you enter his domain, he marks you. He won't rest until he's taken back what he believes belongs to him." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every creak and groan of the house making my heart race. I felt like something was watching me from the shadows, waiting. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. As the days passed, the feeling only grew stronger. The shadows seemed to grow darker, more solid, until one night, I woke up to see a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall and thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as it stared down at me, a faint, twisted smile on its face. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice raspy and cold. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would go away, and when I opened them again, the figure was gone. But the fear lingered, and I knew it wouldn't leave until I did something about it. The next day, I called Nick and told him we needed to go back to the mansion. He was reluctant at first, who could blame him, but eventually, he agreed. We had to confront whatever it was that had marked us, or we'd never be free. We made our way back to the mansion at dusk, the sky a dark, bruised purple. The house loomed over us, more menacing than ever, as if it knew we were coming. The front door creaked open on its own as we approached, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. But we had no choice. This was the only way. Inside, the air was colder than before, thick with the scent of decay. The shadows seemed to ripple around us, and the faint whisper of voices filled the air. They weren't words exactly, more like fragmented thoughts, anger, sadness, desperation. As we made our way back to the study, where we'd seen the open book, I could feel a heavy presence pressing down on us. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to keep going. When we reached the study, the book was still there, but this time, The pages weren't blank. Scrawled across them, in a dark, crimson ink, was a single word: leave. What do we do? Nick whispered, his voice shaking. We apologize, I said, the words coming to me from somewhere deep inside, like an instinct. We tell him we're sorry. We both knelt down, our heads bowed, and I whispered, we're sorry. We didn't mean to disturb you. Please, let us go. We won't come back. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the air grew colder, and a deep, guttural voice echoed through the room. You shouldn't have come here, but I'll let you leave. For now. The book slammed shut, and a gust of icy wind blew through the room, extinguishing the faint light that had been coming through the cracked window. The shadows seemed to recede, and I felt a weight lift off my chest. Nick and I stood up, our knees shaking, and made our way out of the mansion as quickly as we could. As we stepped outside, the air felt fresh and clean, as if the house had finally let us go. We didn't say a word on the way back to town. We didn't need to. We both knew that whatever haunted that mansion had given us one chance, and one chance only, to walk away. To this day, I still see shadows out of the corner of my eye, and sometimes, I hear faint whispers in the dead of night. But I know better than to go back. I know that whatever is in that house isn't done with me. It's waiting, biding its time, and I have a feeling that someday, it'll call me back. But for now, I'm free.
Alright, here's a continuation for Silent Screams, true creepy horror stories with terrifying encounters with shadow people that will haunt your nights. Here's how it might unfold. It's hard to explain what happened that night. I'd heard stories about shadow people, those dark figures that seem to show up when you least expect them, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. But like most things that go bump in the night, I brushed it off as some urban legend. That was before I experienced it for myself. I've been renting this old house for a few months. It was one of those places that always seemed a little too quiet, with rooms that felt darker than they should, even in the middle of the day. But the rent was cheap, and I figured I could deal with a few quirks. For the most part, things were normal, until one particular night. I'd fallen asleep on the couch after a late-night movie marathon, and the house was dead silent when I woke up. That kind of eerie quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and that's when I saw it, a dark figure standing in the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. Hello. I called out, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the shadows. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. I felt my skin prickle as I stared, my mind racing with a million explanations, each one more ridiculous than the last. I blinked, and just like that, it was gone. I told myself it was nothing, just a shadow cast by the furniture or a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. There was something in my house, something watching me. The days that followed were filled with little moments like that, glimpses of shadows that shouldn't be there, cold spots in rooms that were otherwise warm, and that constant feeling of being watched. It was subtle at first, easy to brush off, but as the days went on, things got worse. One night, I was getting ready for bed when I felt that familiar chill. I turned around, and there it was again, the same dark figure standing at the foot of my bed, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as it took a slow, deliberate step forward. Who are you? I managed to stammer, my voice barely more than a whisper. The figure didn't answer, just stared at me with those dark, empty eyes. I felt my heart race, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin as I tried to convince myself I was just dreaming. But the figure was real, solid, its presence filling the room with a heavy, suffocating darkness. I closed my eyes, counting to 3, hoping it would be gone when I opened them. But when I looked again, it was closer, its hand reaching out toward me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I backed away, my mind racing with fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up, staring at the spot where the figure had been, too afraid to close my eyes. I knew I couldn't stay in that house alone, not with whatever that thing was lurking in the shadows. The next night, I invited a friend over, hoping the presence of another person would keep the shadows at bay. We sat in the living room, talking and laughing, and for a while, everything felt normal again. But as the night went on, I felt that familiar chill settle over me, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My friend noticed it too. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear as she whispered, Did you see that?" I nodded, feeling a sinking dread settle over me. We both turned to look down the hallway, where a tall, dark figure was standing, its eyes fixed on us. I felt my heart race as the figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, its form flickering in and out of the shadows. "Let's get out of here," I whispered, grabbing my friend's arm and pulling her toward the door. We stumbled outside, gasping for air, the cold night air a welcome relief from the oppressive darkness inside the house. For the next few days, I stayed with friends, too afraid to go back to the house alone. But eventually, I had no choice. My belongings were still there, and I couldn't avoid it forever. So one evening, I returned, hoping that maybe, somehow the house would feel different, less sinister. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew nothing had changed. The air was thick with that same heavy darkness, the shadows deeper, more menacing than before. I tried to ignore it, moving quickly through the house to gather my things. But every time I turned around, I felt like something was watching me. As I was packing up my bedroom, I felt a sudden chill wash over me, the room growing cold and silent. I turned around, and there it was, the shadow figure standing in the doorway, blocking my only way out. I felt my heart pound in my chest, my mind racing with fear as I stared at the figure, its dark, hollow eyes fixed on me. I took a step back, trying to put as much distance between us as possible, but the figure just stood there watching. And then, without a sound, it lifted its hand, pointing directly at me. "Why are you here?" it whispered, its voice low and hollow, echoing through the room. I stumbled back, my mind reeling as I tried to process what was happening. The figure took a step forward, its form flickering in and out of the shadows, as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. I don't know," I stammered, my voice barely more than a whisper. The figure tilted its head, watching me with a strange, almost curious expression. And then slowly it began to fade, its form dissolving into the shadows until there was nothing left but darkness. I stood there, heart pounding, barely able to breathe as I stared at the empty doorway. I didn't know what I'd just seen, didn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing: I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I grabbed my things, moving as quickly as possible, and left the house without looking back. But even now, as I sit here, far away from that place, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me. Late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I can still feel it, the cold, empty gaze of those hollow eyes, watching me from the shadows. It's hard to talk about that night. I still get chills just thinking about it, but I feel like I need to tell my story. Maybe it'll help someone else who's felt the same fear, seen the same shadows. It all started in the new apartment I rented after moving to a new city. The place was quiet and empty, just the way I liked it. Or so I thought. The first night was strange, but not outright terrifying. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I felt something heavy, an oppressive sensation, settle over the room. It felt like a cold weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I opened my eyes, but everything was pitch black. I told myself it was just the usual anxiety that comes with moving somewhere new. I ignored it and fell back asleep. But then it happened again. The next night, I was sitting in the living room watching TV when I saw it, a dark figure standing in the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't a shadow from the furniture or the low light. This figure had a form, a presence, something solid yet ethereal. I sat up straight, my heart pounding in my chest, but the figure vanished before I could process what I'd seen. "Get a grip," I told myself, trying to laugh it off. But the feeling lingered, a gnawing sense of dread that only grew stronger. I spent the next few days trying to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But every night, I felt it, the weight, the cold, that subtle sense of being watched. Things took a turn for the worse one evening while I was cooking dinner. I had my back to the kitchen door, chopping vegetables, when I heard a faint whisper. It was soft, like a hiss, just barely audible, but enough to make my blood run cold. "Who's there?" I called out, turning around quickly, knife still in my hand. The kitchen was empty. I let out a shaky breath, convincing myself it was just the sound of the pipes or the wind outside. But as I turned back to the cutting board, I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection of the kitchen window. A dark figure standing just inches behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but the figure was gone. The room felt cold, colder than it had any right to be, and my hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone. I texted a friend, begging them to come over, needing someone, anyone, to help break the feeling of isolation and fear that had taken over my apartment. When my friend finally arrived, I tried to act casual, brushing off my experience as new place jitters. But I couldn't ignore the way my friend's face paled as they glanced down the hallway. "Did you see that?" They whispered, eyes wide with fear. "See what?" I asked, my stomach twisting. They pointed down the hallway, where the dark figure was standing, its form just barely visible in the shadows. It was taller than I remembered, its presence more intense, and its hollow, empty eyes were fixed directly on us. My friend grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the front door. "We need to get out of here," they said, their voice trembling. We left the apartment that night, and I stayed at my friend's place, too afraid to go back. But eventually, I had to return. My belongings were there, and I couldn't avoid it forever. So with my friend by my side, I went back, hoping that somehow everything would be normal again. But the moment we stepped inside, I felt it, that heavy, oppressive weight, colder and darker than ever. The air was thick, suffocating, and the shadows seemed to move, shifting and swirling as if they were alive. My friend looked at me, their face pale, and I knew they felt it too. We went from room to room, checking every corner, every closet, but the figure was nowhere to be found. I thought maybe somehow it was gone, that we were safe. But as we stepped into the bedroom, I felt a chill run down my spine. There, standing at the foot of the bed, was the figure. It was darker than before, its form more defined, and I could see the faint outline of a face, cold, empty eyes staring at me, its mouth twisted into a faint, unnatural smile. "Why are you here?" it whispered, its voice low and hollow, echoing through the room. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, trapped in its gaze. My friend grabbed my arm, pulling me back, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot. The figure took a step forward, its eyes locked on mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like my very soul was being pulled into the darkness. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving nothing but an empty, cold silence. I collapsed onto the bed, my mind reeling, and my friend sat beside me, their face pale and shaken. For the next few weeks, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, haunted by the memory of those hollow eyes and that twisted smile. I tried everything, salted the doorways, burning sage, even calling in a paranormal investigator. But nothing helped. The figure continued to appear, always lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. And then, one night, it all came to a head. I was lying in bed, too afraid to close my eyes, when I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and I knew it was there, standing at the foot of my bed. I opened my eyes, and there it was, the figure, its face inches from mine, its eyes dark and empty, filled with a malice I couldn't comprehend. I felt paralyzed, trapped, as it leaned closer, its mouth opening in a silent scream. "Why, you here?" it whispered, its voice barely more than a hiss. I closed my eyes, whispering a quiet prayer, hoping, begging for it to go away. And then, in a moment of clarity, I remembered something an old friend had once told me. Sometimes, facing your fear is the only way to banish it. With every ounce of strength I had, I opened my eyes, staring directly into those dark, empty voids. "This is my home," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You don't belong here." For a moment, the figure seemed to hesitate, its form flickering, as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. And then slowly, it began to fade, dissolving into the shadows until there was nothing left but darkness. The air grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I lay back, taking a deep breath, finally able to relax for the first time in weeks. I never saw the figure again. The shadows returned to normal, and the apartment felt lighter, warmer, as if whatever darkness had been haunting me was finally gone. But even now, late at night, I sometimes feel a faint chill, a reminder of those hollow eyes and that twisted smile. And I wonder, here's a continuation of the Silent Scream series with true creepy horror stories, unnerving night shift terrors. It was my third week on the night shift, and I'd already fallen into the rhythm of it. The quiet hum of empty halls, the gentle click of keyboards from the 24-hour workers, the smell of stale coffee lingering in a break room. Working late hours at a nearly deserted office had its perks, but there was an eerie feeling to it too, a strange stillness that clung to every corner. The night shift was supposed to be peaceful, easy even, but that was before things started happening. I don't know exactly when I first started noticing them, those small, unsettling things that didn't seem to make sense. Maybe it was the shadows that shifted just out of sight, or the soft, almost imperceptible whispers I'd sometimes hear as I passed the break room. It started as little stuff, easy to brush off when you're running on little sleep and a steady stream of caffeine. But one night, something happened that I just couldn't ignore. I was working late, cleaning up some overdue reports that needed to be in by morning. I was the only one on the floor, the others already gone home. The lights were dimmed to save energy, leaving only the glow of my screen to keep me company. It was quiet, too quiet, like the building was holding its breath. A soft rustle caught my attention. I glanced up, staring into the empty expanse of cubicles. Nothing, just rows of desks bathed in shadow, stretching out into the darkness. I was about to chalk it up to my imagination when a faint clicking noise broke the silence. It sounded like fingers tapping on a keyboard, soft and rhythmic. "Hello," I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. No answer. I swallowed, feeling a chill settle in my chest, and walked over to investigate. The tapping continued, steady and unhurried, coming from the far side of the room. My footsteps echoed softly as I made my way through the maze of cubicles, the dim glow of the emergency lights casting long shadows across the floor. As I rounded the corner, I froze. One of the computers was on, its screen flickering with static. But no one was sitting there. My breath caught as the tapping continued, the keys moving on their own, spelling out nonsense words that seemed to shift and swirl on the screen. I took a step back, feeling a wave of unease wash over me. That's when I heard it, a whisper soft and low, coming from right behind me. "Why are you here?" I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. The room was empty, just rows of silent cubicles and the eerie glow of the flickering screen. I forced a laugh, telling myself it was just the late hour getting to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next few nights were the same. Little things, small noises that didn't add up. Footsteps echoing down empty halls, the faint rustle of papers when no one was around. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the late hours mess with my head. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Then came the night when things took a turn for the worse. I'd been at my desk, working on another late-night report, when I heard the faint sound of a phone ringing. It was coming from one of the empty offices down the hall, a muffled, insistent buzz that grew louder with each ring. I hesitated, glancing around, but the place was empty. I was the only one on the floor. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked down the hall, the ringing growing louder with each step. It led me to an office at the end of the corridor, one that I was pretty sure had been locked for years. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness waiting just beyond the threshold. I reached for the handle, feeling a strange sense of dread settle over me, but before I could pull it open, the ringing stopped. I hesitated, feeling my pulse quicken, but then I heard something else, a soft, rhythmic breathing coming from just beyond the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. The breathing stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it felt unnatural. I stood there, hand on the door, heart pounding, until a low, guttural whisper broke the silence. "Come in." I stumbled back, heart racing as the door swung open on its own, revealing an empty room shrouded in darkness. The air was thick, heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on me, filling the room with a sense of malevolence that made my skin crawl. I backed away, refusing to look into the darkness, but just as I turned to leave, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was tall, its face obscured by shadows, its eyes dark and empty. I froze, feeling a wave of terror wash over me as it took a step forward, its movement slow and deliberate. "Why are you here?" it whispered, its voice low and hollow. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, trapped in its gaze. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot, held in place by an invisible force. The figure moved closer, its face coming into focus, and I realized with a jolt of horror that it was staring at me with my own face, an empty, lifeless version of me, eyes dark and hollow, mouth twisted into a twisted, mocking smile. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and the figure vanished, leaving me alone in the empty hallway. I ran, not stopping until I reached the safety of my desk, where I collapsed into my chair, trying to catch my breath. For the next few nights, I tried to forget what I'd seen, but the memory haunted me, creeping into my thoughts, filling my mind with images of that dark, empty face. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for me to let my guard down. And then, one night, it happened again. I was working late, the office empty and silent, when I heard the faint sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but they grew louder with each step, echoing through the empty halls. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked toward the door, my footsteps echoing softly in the silence. As I reached the hallway, the footsteps stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Why are you here?" I froze, feeling a wave of terror wash over me. But before I could turn to leave, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the hallway into darkness. I stumbled back, feeling my way along the wall, heart racing as the whisper grew louder, filling the silence with its mocking, malevolent tone. "Why are you here?" I forced myself to turn, peering into the darkness, and there, at the end of the hallway, was the figure again. It was tall, its face obscured by shadows, its eyes dark and empty. I took a step back, feeling a sense of dread settle over me, but the figure only moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate. "Why are you here?" it whispered, its voice low and hollow. I stumbled back, my mind racing with fear, but the figure only moved closer, its face coming into focus, and I realized with a jolt of horror that it was staring at me with my own face, an empty, lifeless version of me, eyes dark and hollow, mouth twisted into a twisted, mocking smile. I turned and ran, heart pounding, not stopping until I reached the safety of my desk, where I collapsed into my chair, trying to catch my breath. For the next few nights, I tried to forget what I'd seen, but the memory haunted me, creeping into my thoughts, filling my mind with images of that dark, empty face. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for me to let my guard down. And then, one night, it happened again. I was working late, the office empty and silent, when I heard the faint sound of footsteps coming from the... I took a deep breath, forcing myself to steady my nerves, but my hands trembled as I looked around the empty office. The footsteps had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I wanted to go home, to run out of that place and never look back, but I couldn't leave. My keys were in a break room, back down that darkened hallway. The thought of returning down that hallway made my skin crawl, but I didn't have a choice. I took a deep breath and started walking, each step echoing in the silence. The lights flickered above me, casting long shadows that seemed to move, shifting like figures in the corner of my vision. I told myself it was just the late hour getting to me, just my mind playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I reached the break room door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. The air felt thick, heavy, with a strange metallic scent that clung to the back of my throat. I swallowed, forcing myself to turn the handle and step inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the vending machine in the corner. I took a step forward, scanning the room, and that's when I saw it, a shadow tall and thin, standing in the far corner, facing the wall. I froze, my heart pounding as I stared at the figure. It was just standing there, unmoving, its back turned to me, its head bowed as if it were waiting. I took a shaky breath, every instinct screaming at me to run, but something held me in place, some morbid curiosity that I couldn't shake. I took a step closer, my footsteps barely audible over the hum of the vending machine. Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there, its shadow stretching across the floor. And then slowly it began to turn. I held my breath, feeling a wave of dread wash over me as it turned to face me, its face hidden in the shadows. "Why are you here?" it whispered, its voice low and hollow, echoing through the room. I took a step back, my heart racing as the figure moved closer, its face coming into the dim light. It was pale, gaunt, its eyes dark and empty, staring at me with a look of quiet, unnerving intensity. I felt my knees go weak, a chill spreading through my veins as it took another step forward. "You don't belong here," it said, its voice barely more than a whisper, but filled with a strange, otherworldly resonance that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a chair, and the figure tilted its head, watching me with a strange, almost curious expression. And then, without warning, it smiled, a cold, twisted smile that stretched too wide, too unnatural. My heart pounded in my chest, and I forced myself to turn, stumbling out of the break room and into the hallway. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty building. I reached the elevator, slamming the button over and over, praying it would come quickly. The doors slid open, and I threw myself inside, jamming the button for the ground floor. As the doors began to close, I saw it, the figure standing at the end of the hallway, watching me. Its eyes were empty, dark, like twin voids staring into my soul. I held my breath, willing the doors to close, and just as they did, I heard it, a whisper soft and haunting, echoing through the elevator. "Why are you here?" The elevator began to descend, but the whisper stayed with me, filling the silence, growing louder with each passing second. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but it was inside my head, echoing over and over, relentless. When the doors finally opened on the ground floor, I stumbled out, my legs shaking, barely able to keep myself upright. The lobby was empty, silent, the night guard's desk abandoned. I didn't care, I just wanted to get out, to leave that place behind. I burst through the front doors, gasping for air as I stepped into the cool night. The street was deserted, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. I took a shaky breath, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me. It was over, I was out. But as I started to walk away, I heard it again. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from just behind me. I froze, my heart pounding, and slowly turned to look back at the building. There, in the lobby window, was the figure. It was standing in the shadows, watching me, its face obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and empty, filled with a quiet, unyielding malevolence. I took a step back, my heart racing, and that's when I heard it. The whisper, faint but unmistakable, carried on the night breeze. "Why are you here?" I ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty streets, not stopping until I was blocks away, my lungs burning, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, didn't dare, afraid of what I might see. But even now, as I sit here, miles away from that building, I can still feel it. That presence, that cold, malevolent gaze, watching me from the shadows. I don't know who or what it was, but I know one thing. It's still there, waiting, watching, and somehow I know that if I ever go back, it will be waiting for me. And sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I can still hear it. The whisper, soft and haunting, echoing through the silence. Why are you here? I'm not sure how to start this story. It's one of those things you can't really shake, a memory that sits heavy in the back of your mind, waiting for a quiet moment to creep back to the surface. I never thought something as simple as a swimming pool could carry such dark memories, but I guess life has a way of surprising you. I've been working as a night shift lifeguard for a few months, just to pick up some extra cash. The pool was part of an old sports complex just outside of town, mostly used for late-night swim classes and the occasional all-nighter fitness fanatic. It was always weird being there after dark. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the echo of the water, and the empty lanes stretching out like they were waiting for something. It was around 2 a.m. when I first felt it, that sensation that something was just off. The air was too thick, the shadows a little too deep. But hey, you're alone at a creepy old pool, your mind's bound to play tricks on you, right? The night seemed like any other until the temperature dropped. It was subtle at first, just a chill creeping up my spine, but then it got colder, unnaturally so. I found myself rubbing my arms, wondering if the HVAC had malfunctioned again. But then the lights started to flicker slowly at first, just a few dimming in and out like they were on a timer. And that's when I heard it. A faint splash. The pool was empty, I was sure of it. My heart pounded a bit faster as I scanned the lanes. There was nothing, no one, just a single ripple disturbing the water. Hello, I called out, my voice echoing into the emptiness. No response, just silence, broken only by the faint hum of the lights overhead. I took a few steps closer to the pool's edge, looking down at the still water, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But that was when I saw something, a shadow or maybe a reflection. It seemed to flicker in the water, shifting as if it were watching me. I took a shaky breath, trying to push down the unease clawing its way up my throat. Is someone there? I asked again, my voice sounding more vulnerable than I'd hoped. A sudden chill washed over me, an icy grip that settled in my bones. I stumbled back, gripping the edge of a nearby chair, and my mind raced with irrational thoughts. I knew it was crazy, but I swear, I felt like something was lurking in the water, something waiting just below the surface. My radio crackled, breaking the silence. I flinched, fumbling with it, hoping it was just maintenance or another guard. Is everything okay over there? The voice on the other end asked, sounding almost muffled, like they were speaking underwater. Why, yeah, I stammered, forcing myself to sound normal. I thought I heard something in the pool, but it's probably just a pipe or something. Better safe than sorry. Keep an eye out. The voice replied before the radio went dead. I took a shaky breath, shaking off the lingering unease. But as I looked back at the water, I noticed something floating just below the surface. It was faint, almost transparent, like a pale shape slowly drifting along the pool floor. My pulse quickened as I leaned closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Was it a face? A sudden splash broke the silence, and I jerked back, my eyes darting to the far end of the pool. The water had shifted, disturbed by something unseen, as if someone had jumped in. I clenched my fists, feeling the urge to run, but somehow rooted to the spot, morbidly curious. Who's there? I shouted, though my voice sounded shaky and weak. For a moment, everything went still, and I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then a faint whisper echoed through the room, barely audible but unmistakable. My name. Someone or something was whispering my name. No, this isn't happening, I whispered, my hand shaking as I backed away from the pool. Suddenly, a figure appeared, pale and dripping, standing on the far side of the pool. I blinked, thinking it must be a trick of the lights, a figment of my overactive imagination. But the figure just stood there, staring at me with hollow, dark eyes, water pooling around its feet. Why are you here? I stammered, feeling a sense of dread sink deep into my stomach. The figure didn't answer, just continued to stare, unblinking, its expression a mix of sorrow and something darker. I felt trapped, unable to look away as it took a step forward and then another until it was inches from the water's edge. A cold, wet hand reached up from the pool, pale fingers stretching toward me, claw-like and desperate. I stumbled back, tripping over a chair, and scrambled to my feet, heart pounding so loudly I thought it would burst. "You left me," the figure whispered, its voice echoing through the empty room. I shook my head, choking back a scream. I don't know you. I don't." The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a heartbeat. When they came back on, the figure was gone, but the wet footprints remained, leading from the water's edge toward the far corner of the room. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't leave. I had to know. I followed the footprints, each step heavy, the air thick with a damp, musty smell like old water. The footprints led to a door I'd never seen before, a small rusted door hidden behind an equipment rack. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, the metal cold and slick under my fingers. I took a deep breath, gathering my courage, and opened the door. The room beyond was small and dark, filled with old pool equipment and faded posters from decades past. But in the center of the room was a small, covered pool, a forgotten, abandoned pool, murky and still. Something about it felt wrong, ancient, as if it held secrets that should have stayed buried. A faint splash echoed from the dark water, and I froze, heart racing as I watched a ripple spread across the surface. "Please," a voice whispered, soft and broken. "Don't leave me." The voice was coming from the pool, echoing in a small, silent room. I took a step closer, drawn by a strange compulsion, and peered into the murky depths. For a moment, I saw nothing, just dark water and the faint shimmer of light on the surface. But then slowly, a face appeared, pale and ghostly, staring up at me with hollow eyes. I stumbled back, a scream catching in my throat. The face faded, but the whispering continued, echoing through the room, filling my mind with images of cold water and drowning. I turned to leave, but the door had vanished. Panic rose in my chest as I spun around, desperately searching for a way out, but all I could see was the small, dark pool and the face staring up at me. "Stay with me," the voice whispered, soft and pleading. "No," I whispered, backing away, trying to shake off the cold grip of fear. "I can't. I have to." The water surged, a hand reaching up from the depths, clawing at the air. I turned to run, but the room seemed to stretch, the walls closing in, trapping me. The whispering grew louder, filling my mind, drowning out my thoughts. And then silence. The room was empty, the water still. I stood there, heart pounding, unable to shake the feeling that I was not alone, but I could still hear it. The silence was oppressive, thick, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. I was frozen, staring at the dark pool, half expecting that pale hand to emerge again from the depths. But there was nothing, just the still, dark water and my own trembling breaths. I took a shaky step back, feeling for the walls, trying to steady myself. But the air was heavy, and I was exhausted, my mind unraveling with every passing second. All I wanted was to get out, to leave this forgotten room, and never look back. But as I reached for the spot where the door had been, my hand met nothing but cold, rough wall. Panic clawed at me, and I began to breathe faster, my hands scrabbling desperately along the walls, searching for an escape. "Please, let me out," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the suffocating silence. But there was no response, only the quiet echo of my voice and the faint, oppressive smell of chlorine. I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself, and leaned against the wall, letting out a shaky breath. There had to be a way out, I told myself. I just needed to think. And then in the silence, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic drip, like water leaking from a pipe. It was coming from the far side of the room, just beyond the small pool. My pulse quickened, every fiber of my being telling me not to go near that water again. But the drip continued, steady, almost hypnotic, drawing me closer. As I approached, I could feel the temperature drop again, that unnatural chill settling into my bones. The dripping grew louder, reverberating off the walls until it filled the room, each drop echoing in my head, as if it were sinking into my very thoughts. I swallowed, feeling a sense of dread settle over me, but I kept moving forward, unable to stop myself. When I reached the edge of the pool, I saw it. There, on the slick, tiled floor, was a trail of wet footprints, leading away from the water and into the shadows. The footprints were small, like those of a child, and they shimmered in the dim light, as if they were freshly made. A chill ran down my spine, and I took a step back, my mind racing with questions. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beyond the shadows, waiting for me to make a move. And then, from the darkness, a voice whispered, soft and eerie, "You left me." I gasped, heart pounding as I scanned the room, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next. But there was no one there, only the empty darkness and those haunting, wet footprints. No, I didn't. I didn't leave anyone," I whispered, my voice trembling. The voice came again, softer this time, almost a whimper. "Please help me." I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to look down at the footprints. They led into a dark corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to twist and shift, hiding something from view. I knew I shouldn't follow, knew that whatever lay beyond those shadows was something I didn't want to see. But the voice was so small, so helpless. And against all reason, I found myself taking a step forward, then another, following the trail. As I reached the shadows, the temperature dropped even further, the air so cold it burned my skin. My breath came out in visible puffs, and my fingers went numb as I stretched out a hand, feeling for the wall. But instead of solid brick, my fingers touched something cold and smooth, like glass. I leaned closer, squinting in a dim light, and realized I was looking in a mirror large and cracked, its surface smeared with water stains. My reflection stared back at me, pale and gaunt, eyes wide with fear. But as I looked closer, I noticed something was off. My reflection's eyes were darker than mine, hollow and empty, like they'd been drained of life. And then slowly my reflection smiled, a cold, twisted smile that sent a jolt of terror through me. I stumbled back, heart racing, as the mirror began to shift, the glass rippling like water. The reflection faded, and in its place, I saw the face of a child, pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. Her hair was damp, clinging to her face, and her lips were blue, as if she'd been submerged in water for too long. "Please, help me," she whispered, her voice echoing through the room. My throat tightened, and I reached out, my fingers hovering just inches from the glass. What happened to you?" The girl's expression twisted with pain, and she looked down, her lips moving as if she were speaking, but no sound came out. I leaned closer, straining to hear, and that was when I noticed something. Around her neck, faint but unmistakable, were bruises, dark, hand-shaped bruises. A wave of nausea washed over me as the pieces began to click into place. This girl, she hadn't drowned. She'd been drowned. I stumbled back, horror twisting in my gut as the girl's eyes met mine, her gaze filled with an indescribable sorrow. And then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone, her face dissolving into the darkness of the mirror. The room was silent again, the oppressive stillness settling over me like a weight. I backed away, heart racing, my mind reeling from what I'd just seen. But as I turned to leave, I felt something cold and wet wrap around my ankle, pulling me back. I looked down, choking back a scream as I saw a pale, skeletal hand emerging from the floor, its fingers digging into my skin with an icy grip. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the hand only tightened, pulling me closer to the dark, empty pool. "No, let go," I screamed, desperation clawing at my throat. But the hand didn't let go. It pulled me closer, dragging me toward the edge of the pool, where the water was churning, dark and murky. I clawed at the floor, my nails scraping against the tiles, but it was no use. The hand was too strong. And then, just as I was about to be pulled into the water, a voice echoed through the room, clear and strong. "Leave him alone." The grip on my ankle loosened, and I scrambled back, heart pounding as I looked around, trying to find the source of the voice. But there was no one there, Only the empty room and the silent, dark pool. The hand vanished, sinking back into the floor, and the room grew still once more. I took a shaky breath, relief flooding through me as I realized I was free. But as I looked back at the pool, I felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss that I couldn't quite explain. The girl's face flashed in my mind, her pleading eyes, the bruises on her neck. I knew somehow that she was still there, trapped in that dark, forgotten pool, waiting for someone to save her. I didn't know what had happened to her, didn't know who had taken her life or why. But I knew one thing, I couldn't leave her here, not like this. I stood up, taking a deep breath as I approached the pool's edge once more. The water was still, calm, reflecting the dim light like a dark mirror. I closed my eyes, whispering a quiet prayer, and then slowly, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, silver necklace, the token I'd found on the floor earlier that night. I didn't know if it would help, didn't know if it would give her peace. But as I dropped it into the water, I felt a warmth settle over me, a gentle, comforting presence that eased the fear in my heart. The water rippled, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw her face again, smiling up at me from the depths. And then, just like that, she was gone, the water still once more. I took a step back, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over me. The room felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted, and I knew somehow that she was finally at rest. With a final glance at the pool, I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing through the empty room. And as I stepped through the door, back into the cold, quiet halls of the complex, I felt a sense of closure settle over me, a feeling that the nightmare was finally over. But as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone was watching me from the shadows. And as I glanced back one last time, I thought I saw a figure standing by the pool, her face pale and ghostly, her eyes filled with gratitude. And then she was gone, leaving nothing but the quiet, empty room behind.